So the goal of today is to get you ready to render for your final projects due next week. And I have this here animation that I did last week, and don't worry about that just yet. Actually, I'm going to delete that. Okay. So here's the animation I did when I covered kind of making your camera a little bit more fancy. It's just a walk cycle, and then the camera slows down a bit and then speeds back up and zooms out. So now I want to render it and get it ready to make into an actual movie. So the first thing that I'm going to do is figure out what my render time is and how long it's going to take. I'm going to set my resolution, or my desired resolution, right here, so 1920 by 1080, and I want it at 100%. Scroll down a little bit, and on my output, I'm going to set it to, we can do PNG, we can do JPEG. I'm going to do JPEG. If I was doing something with transparency with an alpha channel, then I would do PNG. Set the quality to 100%. Set my sampling. I'm going to start at about 100, and we'll go from there. I do have a little bit of motion blur on here. I also have a little bit of depth of field set, which I have gone over before. And OpenGL render anti-aliasing is at 8. I've got my performance set to auto detect, so it'll be using 24 threads. And now I'm just going to hit render the frame, and we'll see how long that takes to render. I do also have a equal rectangular image set as an environment texture, giving a little bit of light, and there's also a sun lamp in the scene. Real simple lighting, just again enough to see the animation, because that's the focus of this project. So this will render, and I'm going to pause the recording for a second. Okay, so it finished rendering. You can see the depth of field in there. This particular frame doesn't have a whole lot of motion blur. You can see a little bit of it on his back foot. But that took 33 seconds for that frame. Now, my animation goes from frame 1 to frame 176. So if I do 176 times 33 seconds, oops, well, okay, we'll do it in the calculator. 176 times 33, that's how many seconds it'll take. Divide that by 60, that's how many minutes it'll take. So that's just over an hour and a half of render time. So now what I can do is I can figure out how much time I want to spend rendering, how much time I can afford to spend rendering, and then tweak the settings accordingly. So if I want it to speed up a little bit, this is 33 seconds. If I turn off motion blur, and well, we'll just turn off motion blur to start and see if that affects it at all. So I will render, oops, that's the wrong button, render it again. Okay, so the render without motion blur is finished, and you can see it saved all of 0.4 of a second, so motion blur doesn't really affect it too much. Now we know. There are a few other things that you can adjust. Perhaps the most obvious is your samples. So if I look at this right now, and we can't really see this full screen, so if I hit Shift Space and then hit the Home key, actually that's not. So I did 1080, so if I zoom in here, that looks about full frame. I see a little bit of noise, especially in the shadowed areas, but not too much. And this is probably what I would do for a render, and actually earlier this is what I rendered out at. But if you need to save a little bit of time, I'll bring the render samples down to 80 and hit render again. Okay, now we're down to 27 seconds. If I wanted to further reduce that, oops, I could change my resolution, and let's go to 1280 by 720, which is the minimum that I would want you to render at. I don't want you to render it anything smaller than that. But 1280 by 720, let's render again and see how that affects it. I should note too, you can see your render progress of that frame in this bar up at the top of the screen, in case you're wondering at any point. Okay, and now we're down to 17 seconds of frame. Okay, so it just gives you an idea of some of the variables you can tweak. The more lights you have in a frame, the more light rays it has to calculate bouncing around, so that's going to increase render time. If you have really complicated models with a lot of vertices and faces, that's going to increase render time. If you have any materials that are translucent, glass, emission materials, those will all speed up render time as well. And especially with lights, those will increase the noise of the scene. So things to keep in mind as you're figuring it out. Now, once you have your desired settings figured out and you know what you're going for, now you actually need to render out the frames. So I've got I'm gonna go back to 1920 by 1080 and set my render back to 100. Those will all stay the same down there. So now I need to go to my output panel right here. Now output, the first thing is this is your destination path. So what I did, and you can see all the frames that are actually there, but I navigated to where I wanted to save all of these frames. Remember, I'm rendering out by frames. I'm not going to render straight to a movie. That way, if the render crashes halfway through, whatever frames are already rendered, I still have. I don't have to redo. If you render out straight to a movie and the render crashes, you lose all of it. Okay, so in 3D Basics, I created a folder called render files, and then a folder for this particular project, Bali Walk Camera is what I called it. So you can create a new folder right here with the Create New Directory button, and you can see this is where I saved all of my images. So once you navigate to the folder you want to save all your images to, click Accept. Now you've got a few other options. You can change your file format. Again, you want to stay with a still image format, not a movie, and I would generally say PNG or JPEG will cover all of your needs. You can set your quality, make sure you got RGB set, and then once you have that figured out, you render the animation, and it'll go through and render each frame in order. Oh, I should also note, I believe, never mind, I'm a liar, ignore that. So once you have all of those rendered out, if I jump over here to my Finder, this is that folder that I saved everything to, and then I have 176 images in order in this frame that I can preview. Now another handy thing about rendering out this way is that if you just want one still frame just as kind of a preview image for a portfolio or anything like that, you've got every single frame as an image. You don't have to worry about doing screenshots. Not that that's that big of a deal, but it's just kind of a nice little bonus. So I've got my animation all figured out. I'm happy with it. Oh, it also means that if I need to re-render a little segment of this, then I can just re-render those frames and just pop them into the sequence. So once I have everything rendered out, and now I need to turn these still images into a movie. The way that most of you will be familiar with this is with After Effects. So in After Effects, to import the image sequence, go File, Import, or you can just double click in the project window, navigate to where your files are. You only have to select the first one. You'll notice down here JPEG sequence is checked. Click Open and drag that down, and here's your composition. Hit space, and there you go. And then you can use After Effects' export settings and render it out however you so choose. For our purposes in this class, H.264 works just great. You know, make sure that the quality is not degraded too much, and it's still a lightweight file. So once you do that, then you can hit render and just turn that in. Now, you can also do this in Blender, and it's a similar process. And what Blender uses is something we actually haven't covered yet in Blender, and that's the video sequence editor. You can do video editing in Blender. It's obviously not a video editor, but those features are there. If you want to work entirely in Blender, you can. So to do that, I'm going to change this view to my video sequence editor, and this is what I get. I've got a bunch of different tracks here. If I hit N, it brings up a properties panel, but there's nothing currently in the frame, so you can't really see anything there. You've got seconds on the bottom here. Oh, seconds plus frames. So you can see we're at 23 frames, 1 second, 1 second plus 2 frames. So that's how that works. To add your images, I'm going to hit Shift left, go back to the first frame, hit Add Image, navigate to my folder with all of the images. I'm going to hit A to select all of them and click Add Image Strip. Okay, so here's my image strip. Now if I hit N, you can see I've got options to edit. I can do some simple crossfades and do some cropping and play it backwards if I wanted to. There's various controls you can play around with. And then that's all I have to do in the video sequence editor. Okay, now I'm going to go back to my render panel, and if you go down here to where is it? Post-processing, which right now it's all the way at the bottom of my frame. I'm going to move it up. Whoops. I'm going to move it up to the top so that you can see it. So this post-processing frame has two checkboxes, compositing and sequencer. Compositing refers to the node editor. If you have compositing nodes set up for your scene, which is this one right here, this checkbox tells Blender when it renders to include these nodes in the post-processing. So that's how you get the motion blur or the defocus depth of field effect. The other one is the sequencer, and what this is telling is incorporate the sequencer into your render. So if I uncheck this right now and click render animation, it's going to render out each frame again. Now with sequencer checked, what it's going to do is render out what's ever in the sequencer. But first what I have to do is set my output again. So now that I want to render out a movie, I'm going to set my output. I'm going to do QuickTime, and once I do that, I'm going to change my video codec to H.264. I can set my quality, set my output wherever I want that to go. And now when I hit render animation, what it's doing is it's loading each of those images and converting that into a video file. This is a much quicker process than rendering out each individual frame, because this is taking a little less than a second a frame. And then once that's done, wherever you told it to save, you will have a video file. And that is almost there. Okay, my render to video is done. I jump into Finder. Here it is. Hit play. And there's my render. It is that simple.